Hi, this is Meredith Lego, and I'm doing a series of teachings on Ascension science. A lot of the content that I am teaching comes from connection to a being who is Ascended Master Hilarion, and I basically connect to him during or shortly after meditation and channel concepts or teachings that have to do with ascension of the human consciousness and how we sort of move past the need for the reincarnational patterns that we go through. And if you're new to the channel, I do highly encourage that you start at the beginning because there's many concepts that sort of build upon each other. Now, the last few videos that I got into dealt with the actual stages of ascension. And one of the things that I thought would be interesting to share is how some of the Egyptian practices or teachings relate to these stages. And I was lucky enough to be able to attract these learnings to myself along the way as well. But it was interesting because by then I had already channeled about the stages of ascension from Hilarion and found it fascinating how much some of the early Egyptian, I'm not sure if they were mystery schools or not, but essentially they set up a whole learning platform around these stages as well. So what I learned, and I'll share at least one of the sources I learned through, and there are other sources that I learned through along the way, but unfortunately I don't remember who the sources were, otherwise I'd let you know about them. But the Egyptians created a whole series of temples along the Nile River that were dedicated to helping initiates, if you will, master the various stages of ascension that we've just gone through. And so I found that was kind of fascinating. Now, one of the sources that I learned from was an individual named Drunvalo Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is, if you kind of go into sort of, I don't want to say hierarchy of teaching because that implies like a hierarchical structure, but these would be a collective consciousness of teachers that are basically teaching unity consciousness. So Drunvalo is basically tapped into that consciousness. And he's still alive today and he's still teaching. But he wrote a book, or a series of books actually, called The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, version 1 and 2, and some of the content that I came across happened to be in version 2. But as I mentioned before, there's been other teachers, I think they came in through channel teachings that actually talked about similar concepts. And again, this happened after I channeled the stages from Hilarion that I just shared with you. So, as I mentioned before, the Egyptians set up these temples along the Nile, and like one of the temples or stages would help an initiate master aspects of the physical body. I'm not sure entirely what that looked like. Maybe that was about, what you eat, or, maybe it's exercise, stuff like that. Another temple then kind of focused on managing sexual energies, and there's actually some material because at some point I was curious about sexual energies because it's interesting that it's sort of an energy that sort of emanates up from within the body. And so I did ask Hilarion about it, and maybe I'll share it in future videos. But they definitely taught the initiatives sort of how to master that energy and sort of redirect it back into the physical body in order to actually create healing inside the body, as well as help with longevity of life, because the longer you're alive, the more that you have the ability to sort of ascend your consciousness. And that was very important to the Egyptians. So one of the things, and I guess they set up, other temples that got into the ego and all the other kind of aspects that we talked about. But one of the things that and I'm going to quote Drunvalo here, that he talks about in his book, it is really key. He says that fear was and still is the primary force that stops a person from growing into the light. And light really is nothing more than increased wisdom, because light or photons carry wisdom and can carry data. I'll tell you about that at the end, so I don't kind of want to break this paragraph now. So he goes on to say that as we move into higher worlds of light, we manifest our thoughts and feelings directly. So again, as we go on to higher worlds of light or wisdom, higher dimensions of consciousness, we manifest our thoughts and feelings indirectly. And so, as I talked about in the past videos that I channeled from Hilarion, and this would be sort of in the first maybe 1, 2, and 3 series, we need to have control over our thoughts and feelings to manifest the realities and the timelines that really have the highest integrity and benefit for ourselves and for the upliftment of others and for the upliftment of all beings. And that really does tie to the concept of kind of cosmic law, or the law of one. So in those examples I talked about, if I'm sort of thinking about sort of I think it was a gorilla with an axe or something like that, or a chainsaw, I wouldn't want to manifest it in the moment. And as a result, we're in a sort of a plane of existence right now that time is slowed down. Our understanding or experience of linear time, even though there is no time, but our experience of it is slowed down so that we have more time to have a thought, basically experience it, process that experience and reintegrate that teaching or that lesson into new experiences. So there's more time in between our thought and the manifestation of it, so that we have more time to connect the dots on the fact that it's our thoughts and our feelings that are actually manifesting our reality. So what happens is that as you start to ascend in your consciousness a little bit more, and you start to control more of your vibrational frequencies, there's less time in between your thoughts and your manifested reality. So again, I'm sure higher density beings want to make sure that sort of, people that are starting to interact with have high integrity of their thoughts and their feelings in what's really best, in the best and highest good for all involved. So that's kind of how he set up the concept of the schools that basically were teaching this in Egypt. But one example that he did note is a temple called Kom Ombo, and I probably totally mispronounced that name, but it's Komombo. And the theme of this particular temple was focused on teaching polarity. And obviously the most stark polarity that we have in our third dimension reality is sort of male-female. And much of what they focused on was teaching overcoming fears, as well as sort of the sexual energies between the different polarities. And again, if you kind of go back to some of the teachings that I got from Hilarion, it's the idea of sort of learning to bring the extreme polarized energies together to more of a neutral point. But in this particular temple, initiates would be forced to face their fears. And there were several examples that they would have to go through, but one example is described by Junvalo in his book, in which an initiate would have to basically swim. So this would be inside of the temple itself, but they would have to swim down a chamber. So this would be like a pool of water. They'd have to swim down a chamber, and there was a wall in front of them. But at the bottom of that chamber, there would be an opening to another pool in which they could go get air. But in this other pool, there would be a bunch of crocodiles. So they would literally have to overcome their fear of the crocodiles being there. Now, they had a couple options for resurfacing to get air. One would be in that pool where the crocodiles were, but they could also swim past that and go, underneath another wall that was there. That essentially would take them out to a chamber where there was no crocodiles, and they could literally exit the pool. Now, one of the things the initiates weren't told is that the crocodiles were well fed in advance of any initiates going through this particular test, they were like overfed. So they were, the initiates were never going to be in any harm, but obviously they did not know that. So they had to overcome their fear, first of all, making it, through kind of a long area in the dark and trying to find a way out, and then overcome their fear of the crocodiles. Some other tests that I've learned about from other teachers that Junvala did not get into his book is that another test would be to float in a river. And I don't know if it was the Nile River, but it was a river and that was basically surrounded that had a lot of crocodiles in it. And the initiates would be asked to float there overnight with the stars above them. And it was believed at that particular time that if you were able to maintain a very neutral vibrational frequency, you wouldn't attract the alligators or the crocodiles to you. Don't know if that's the case or not, because obviously you're now in open nature. But that was sort of a test, was maintaining a very neutral vibrational frequency, or at least you weren't giving off fear. And then there were other tests that involved going out into the desert and going from like one town to another town, or maybe it was to another temple. And it would take you like weeks to get there, and you wouldn't necessarily have any food or water. Now, when I was learning about some of those tests, I was thinking, well, I personally don't condone those as necessarily being good tests to help you understand and advance consciousness. That sounded like more it was like hazing. If you kind of go back to college fraternities and sororities, that sounded more like hazing. But that certainly, obviously they were trying to help their initiates overcome the personality ego complex and the fears that keep us from really moving on to the light. So one of the things that this kind of reminded me of, and I'm kind of looking at notes that I made, was that it reminded me of the movie Matrix. And I don't know if you've seen that movie. It's an interesting movie to watch because it kind of got into some of the concepts that I've learned from Hilarion about sort of the holographic simulation construct that we are in. But within this movie, Morpheus is telling Neo to free his mind, and he is testing him to jump from one building to another. And that is the ultimate case of having to overcome fear. So it kind of reminded me of that particular scenario. So I think probably the bigger lesson in this is just learning to overcome your fears. And as Hilarion did teach me, is that you will be tested. So either you've signed up to experience certain lessons in life, and or you tracked them to you based upon your vibrational frequency. Excuse me. But you will essentially be tested in ways to help you overcome your fear through different experiences that you have. Now, one of the things that I did early days as I was starting to awaken, and I highly recommend this, is to go through an exercise of literally just documenting your fears on a piece of paper. And then when you have a certain fear, look at it and say, wait, is there a deeper fear behind that fear? And you look at the second one and you say, wait, is there a deeper fear behind that fear? So it's kind of like the exercise of going down 5 whys, sort of, here's why, but there's another why behind the why. So it's unpacking the fear to its root source. Now, when I went through this, one of the fears that I had, and this was early days, was let's say, like losing my job. And so really the underlying fear behind that was maybe not manifesting another job or not having money or losing money. So that meant that I probably am holding on to some sort of unconscious feeling about maybe not being abundant or manifesting abundance. But, that being said, that was a fear that I just documented. And so at the end of the day, the why behind that, or the fear behind that, was not being able to survive. And the fear behind that is death, right? So that's what it came down to. And when I did this exercise for myself, and I had like pages of fears, right? But it was important for me to go through this and exploring this. at the end of the day, what I noticed is that there was two key fears that everything was muddling down to. Number one was fear of death, and the second one was fear of not being loved. And it provided a lot of deep-rooted understanding into sort of aspects of my psyche. But at the end of the day, I was aware enough at this point to realize that we really don't die. And in fact, along my sort of journey, I've been able to remember about 30 to 40 past quote-unquote parallel lives. So I can tell you for certain, you don't die. I've remembered the death process of several of those lives. So I do know that consciousness goes on. Only the avatar body or the corporeal unit dies, but you as a being, as a soul, as a consciousness sort of unit, you never die. So check, able to overcome that fear. The other kind of key learning is that you are source, you are one with all source. And so if you have self-love, that is the most important love that you need. When you're trying to seek love from an external source, you're missing the point. So there's a really great quote from the Buddha that basically says that any emotion that you feel, really, emotion is something that can only come from within you. Literally, emotions cannot be passed on to you. They have to come from within your emotional body. So when you have that wonderful feeling of love, and I'm sure you've had it, it's such a wonderful feeling. It's really an emotional state that you're generating within your own emotional body. There could be an external cause for it, but that emotion that you're feeling is from within you. And so if you can generate that love within you for yourself, that's probably the most important thing, because then you overcome fears of sort of attachment to external sources in order to help you create that particular feeling within yourself. And then, frankly, along the way, you might give up some element of your sovereignty. You could. I'm not saying it happens, but, it can happen. And then you fear losing that particular sort of external generated cause for that feeling within yourself. So again, self-love probably was the most important thing, as well as just fear of realizing that you don't really die. So those two things really helped me overcome fears. Prefer to go through that exercise as opposed to going into a lake full of lots of crocodiles. so with that, I wanted to share that, if you're interested in the whole Ascension schools, again, I don't know if they were mystery schools necessarily, but they definitely had Ascension schools that initiates went through, and they had many, many, many levels. I encourage you to do your own research on it. Hopefully that kind of sparked some interest inside of you. So with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.